have employed humor to achieve their goals. You see, charm and wit are very important to a president, and so all our recent chief executives have used a collection of one-liners and anecdotes in their speeches. The ones who have been best at it are Ronald Reagan and Jack Kennedy, but all our presidents have shown a certain talent for comedy. In All the President's Wits, Gerald Gardner talks about how each president's brand of humor has reflected his own personality and character. Gerald traveled with Bobby Kennedy when he ran for the U.S. Senate and kept him supplied with a steady stream of relevant humor along the campaign trail. He helped create that landmark TV show of political humor, That Was the Week That Was, and he's the author of the best-selling series of political humor books, Who's in Charge Here? Here he talks about the power of presidential humor and all the president's wits.
That was a spectacular introduction. Lyndon Johnson once received a similarly lavish introduction from the governor of Michigan, and politicians do enjoy introducing one another. At any rate, when Lyndon Johnson was introduced by the governor of Michigan in these glowing terms, Johnson said, "I wish my parents were alive to hear that introduction. My father would have enjoyed it, and my mother would have believed it." See, humor is a wonderful instrument for a president, or for anyone, of course, in any position of responsibility, but particularly presidents and politicians. Humor, as we all know, is a wonderful device to get us through the stresses and the tensions of life, but beyond that, humor can be a wonderful instrument to deal with people, to manipulate, to persuade, to influence them, and to communicate with them. And this is something that our last several presidents have known very well. We can learn a lot from them. In my book, All the President's Wits, I talk about how our recent presidents, from Kennedy through Reagan, have employed humor to promote their own goals and to promote their views. It's an interesting subject, and I'd like to share some of my findings with you. Now, humor in a president goes a good deal deeper than just gag lines. It really comes out of a kind of intelligence and an understanding about life. It comes out of a grander idea about the scheme of things. And virtually all our best presidents seem to have had a highly developed sense of humor. And contained in it, I think, is an understanding of their own insignificance and their own vulnerability. The great statesmen stride out on the stage, and they realize that they can be reduced to ashes in just an instant, and that they're only a speck of dust, really, in the great scheme of things. And therefore, they try to find humor in the absurdities and the ridiculous situations that they encounter. And the good presidents have all had this ability to laugh. I don't think it's a coincidence that the most admired, even the most beloved presidents of recent years, and I mean Jack Kennedy and Ronald Reagan, are also the presidents who have had the most agreeable sense of humor. Now let's try to look at how some of our recent presidents have employed humor, perhaps how we can learn something about how we all can use it a little better. One of the chief values of humor is that it lets you laugh away anything you don't want to talk about. Any issue that you don't want to face head on, it's a marvelous strategy to just laugh it out of existence. It's always very chilly to say no comment at a press conference. It's much more agreeable to laugh at something. You remember that in the televised debate between Reagan and Mondale, was that his name? Yes. The only issue that Walter Mondale was able to develop that he had even a prayer on was the question of Reagan's age and whether or not he was too old to be president. And Reagan successfully laughed that right out of existence. He said, if you remember, he said, well, I will not make age an issue in this campaign. I will not discuss my opponent's youth and inexperience. And it was an inspired line, and it just washed the issue and Fritz Mondale with it right out of existence. Because he had been telling age jokes for a number of years, Ronald Reagan, about a quarter of a century. One of the things that he said, for example, he said, you know, when Andrew Jackson left the White House, he was 75, and he was still very vigorous. I know because he told me. Now, people laughed at that, and the whole issue of age evaporated. Jack Kennedy employed humor very cleverly to laugh away the things that he didn't want to talk about. Now, if you'll cast your mind back, you'll remember that one of these was his father's money. Joe Kennedy had a great deal of money, and a lot of people resented it. They felt, well, he's buying the election for his son. And it wasn't something you could discuss. It didn't lend itself to debate. And so Jack Kennedy very cleverly laughed it away. He said on one occasion, I've just received this wire from my father. It says, Dear Jack, don't buy one more vote than you need. I'll be damned if I'll pay for a landslide. And another issue that faced Jack Kennedy that really didn't lend itself to serious rhetoric was the question of religion. Now, he did make one serious speech down in Texas in which he addressed the subject, but beyond that, he just tried to laugh it all away. And he said such things as, he said, you know, reporters are asking me whether I feel the Pope is infallible. So I asked my friend Cardinal Spellman how he feels about the Pope's infallibility. And Cardinal Spellman said, I don't know what to tell you, Senator. All I know is he keeps calling me Spillman. Kennedy had another problem, of course, once he got into office, and that was the appointment of his kid brother as Attorney General. Now, you just don't do that. It's the most flagrant sort of nepotism, or that's what it seemed like, and yet you can't discuss it seriously. And so Jack Kennedy had this good sense to try to laugh the whole thing away. On one occasion, he said, well, I see nothing wrong with giving Bobby a little legal experience before he goes out to practice. I had the pleasure of traveling with Bob Kennedy when he ran for the Senate in New York State. I was sort of his resident wit, and I provided him with relevant humor from Coney Island up to Niagara Falls. And Bobby had one serious problem in his campaign, and that was he was called a carpetbagger. Now, as you know, the Kennedys are associated with Boston, and here was Bobby running in New York. Now, that's a long run. And so, what Bobby did, he had to laugh away the whole carpetbagger issue. And at one point, I remember it was on the fairgrounds at Syracuse, the opening day of the state fair. He got up on a platform amidst thousands of people, and he addressed the carpetbagger issue to try to laugh it out of existence. And he said, people, notice he sounded a lot like Jack. People ask me why I came to New York. Well, I was reading the newspaper the other day that California had passed New York in population. And so I turned to my wife and I said, what can we do? So we moved to New York, and in one day we increased the population 10.5. And I challenged my opponent to match that record. He has 60 days to do it. Another problem that Bobby had was charges of ruthlessness. People tended to call him ruthless. He had hounded Jimmy Hoffa into prison. He had a reputation of being cold, callous, and calculating. It sounds like a law firm. He had the problem of being labeled ruthless, and he tried to laugh it away. You couldn't discuss it. He said, people call me ruthless. I'm not ruthless. And if I find the man who's calling me ruthless, I shall destroy him. The most effective kind of humor for a president, or for any politician or any candidate, is a self-deprecating humor. Now, why should that be? Well, when you use self-deprecating humor, you're sort of kidding your own deficiencies. You're kidding your own flaws. You're sort of saying, I'm a regular guy. You don't take yourself too seriously. It's a sign of a lack of pretentiousness. It's a very nice quality. People like that sort of a man. Adlai Stevenson was very good at it. He told a story of encountering a woman, a pregnant woman. She was 8 months pregnant at the National Convention, and she was carrying a sign that said, Stevenson's the man. Another way to make use of humor is to take the edge off a very tense situation. Political figures, public figures, find themselves in the midst of acrimony at times, and humor helps them take the edge off it. Mortzall told me of an occasion when he attended a state dinner at the White House, and Ronald Reagan was entertaining Prime Minister Nixon of Japan. And it was a very testy, very acrimonious, very uncomfortable evening. He said Nakasone was looking forward to the forthcoming anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. And President Reagan wanted to talk about all the Japanese cars that were flooding into the United States. And they were at cross purposes, and it was a very uncomfortable moment. Ronald Reagan began the conversation by saying, he says, I just don't understand, Mr. Prime Minister, I don't understand why a Chevrolet costs $25,000 in Tokyo, and yet there are thousands of Toyotas flooding into Wilmington, Delaware. I just don't understand that. And Mr. Nakasone scowled, and he said, well, I can see that you wouldn't understand that, Mr. President, because after all, we never destroyed one of your cities. And Reagan thought a moment, and he said, how about Detroit? Now, Nakasone laughed, and a rather poisonous situation had passed into history. Another way to employ humor for a public figure is to deflect criticism. All of us have encountered unfriendly audiences across a podium, across a conference table, across a crowded room, whatever. Adlai Stevenson was addressing the Houston Baptist Convention on one occasion, and when he was running for president against Dwight Eisenhower. And he was introduced in a way that you would not wish on your worst enemy. The man who was in charge of the convention turned to Governor Stevenson to introduce him and said, Governor, before I introduce you, I should make it clear that you're just here as a courtesy, because Dr. Norman Vincent Peale has already instructed us to vote for your opponent, ladies and gentlemen, Governor Stevenson. And that was the introduction. And to his credit, Adlai Stevenson crossed to the microphone and said, gentlemen, speaking as a Christian, I find the Apostle Paul appealing and the Apostle Peale appalling. He said, I'm a Unitarian. I pray to whom it may concern. He said, when bigots want to drive a Unitarian out of town, they burn a question mark on his lawn. So Stevenson, too, had taken some of the nastiness out of the air with humor. Now, Richard Nixon is an interesting case. Richard Nixon had no perceptible sense of humor. I pored over thousands of state documents looking for some examples of the Nixon wit, and it is not to be found in the sense that one finds the Kennedy wit or the Reagan or the Johnson wit. And yet there were a couple of occasions when Richard Nixon could be extremely funny, and I mean intentionally funny. Ted Sorensen, who was Jack Kennedy's chief speechwriter, told me of one such occasion. This was the day following President Kennedy's famous inaugural address. And Nixon approached Sorensen and said, Ted, I listened to Jack Kennedy's inaugural address yesterday, and I've got to admit it, there were some words that he said that I wish I had said. And Sorensen was touched by this. He said, thank you, Mr. Vice President. I guess you mean the part about ask not what your country can do for you. Nixon said, no. I mean the part about I do solemnly swear. There was another occasion when I was witness to the rare Nixonian wit. This is back in the early 60s. He was in Los Angeles giving a speech, and I happened to be at the same luncheon. It was a JC affair. It was the 10 Outstanding Young Men of the Year Awards. And several of us were outside when Nixon finished speaking and came out, and a gnarled old waiter approached Nixon, put his arm around him, came up to him and said to him, hello, Dick, how are you? How's Pat? How are the girls? How's Trish? How's Julie? And then the little man limped away in his tattered old busboy outfit, and we looked at Nixon rather astonished. And he looked at us, and with perfect timing, he said, that was one of last year's 10 Outstanding Young Men. He really knew how to apply a needle. Lyndon Johnson was somewhat different from Jack Kennedy. Going from Kennedy to Johnson was like a slow dissolve from Noel Coward to the Dukes of Hazzard. Most of Johnson's stories were very rustic and earthy, and he was sort of a raconteur. His stories taught a lesson. He could have been a teacher had he not gone into politics. And most of the stories sprang from the hill country of Texas, where Johnson grew up to manhood. And his stories tried to teach a lesson, and they somehow were a bit long-winded, but they would be quite amusing. Once Johnson was speaking to a meeting of agency heads in the East Room of the White House, and he was talking about the need to cut the budget. The budget stood at $200 billion. Those were the good old days. And he wanted his agency heads to cut the budget, and he told a story that he wanted to exemplify this. He told of a young boy in Texas, and they're building a railroad right by his front door. So the boy applies for a job on the crew. And the foreman says, well, I'm going to give you an intelligence test. And he asks him a few questions, and the boy answers them. And he says, okay, young fella, here's the big one. You answer this, and you've got yourself a job. He says, suppose you're standing at the switch. Now, you look to the west, and you see a locomotive heading east at 60 miles an hour. Okay? Now, you look to the east. You see another locomotive on the same track heading west at 60 miles an hour. What do you do? And the boy thought a minute, and he said, I run in the house and I get my brother. And the said, how in God's earth would you get your brother? And the boy said, well, he's never seen a train wreck. And Johnson was saying, gentlemen, we had better cut this damn budget or you're going to see one hell of a train wreck. Johnson's humor could be very coarse. Now, one of his aides once said to me, he said, you know, people used to say Johnson was coarse and crude. I worked with him, and I know he was just the opposite, crude and coarse. Johnson would freeze up in front of a TV lens. I mean, on television, he would look like a cross between a riverboat gambler and Machiavelli. But when he was out on the stump, when he was out with his people, he was marvelous. He would tell about a sailor who's out at sea and he gets a telegram reading, your wife has given birth to twins, more to follow. He loved to tell stories about Texas preachers, and he knew dozens of preacher stories. All in, they were all laid in the hill country where he was born. And in one story, a preacher notices a man is asleep in the front row of his congregation, and he's getting more and more angry at this. So finally he whispers, all those who want to go to the kingdom of heaven, stand up. And the entire congregation rises to their feet, except the one man who's asleep, of course. And then the preacher shouts, now all those who want to walk with the devil, stand up. And the sleeping man is startled, and he stands up, and he looks around. And he says, well, preacher, I don't know what we're voting on, but you and I are the only ones for it. One of the most effective presidents we've had at employing humor is undoubtedly Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan has an extraordinary collection of one-liners and anecdotes that he uses for strategic purposes. By the way, it is not true that Mr. Reagan was asked his favorite joke and he said George Bush. But Reagan's humor goes well beyond just the gathering of anecdotes and one-liners and making people feel good for the moment. It's rooted to a large extent in his knowledge about himself and the world. He's lived a lot of life, and I think his intuition is good. He has a good sense of people, how well they do, what is good and bad about them. He's not that solemn and serious about himself or his views. He does promote them very vigorously, but I don't think it worries him when Sam Donaldson scoffs at him and when people don't accept them that universally. And Ronald Reagan's humor is quite genuine. It is shaded a bit by Hollywood. I mean, he does get a load of one-liners in the Hollywood pouch. But there is a true humility about him, and these qualities are in his humor, and it's helped him to capture the affection of an awful lot of people, many of whom don't approve of his policies at all. Mark Russell said, with some truth, he said, you know, Reagan was swept back into office on a landslide of disapproval, and he was. But wherever he goes, whether he's in Maine or Minnesota, Reagan puts people at ease and ingratiates himself with a marvelous sense of humor. He was campaigning in Maine, and he told a story about a Texan who's visiting a farm in New England. And he asked the farmer how big his spread is. And the New Englander says, well, it runs to that clump of trees and over that hill and down to the creek. He says, how big is your spread out in Texas? And the Texan says, oh, well, sometimes I get in my car and I can drive for an hour and a half before I get to the boundary. And the New Englander says, yep, I know what you mean. I once had a car like that. Now, in Minnesota, Reagan visited a farm and said, you know, I feel very much at home here. You know, I'm a rancher. I'm a rancher just like you. I want to assure you the cows in California, they're the same as the cows in Minnesota, except our cows have their teeth capped. Reagan uses humor very effectively to attack the government that he himself is the head of, which I think is rather amusing in itself. He attacks the bureaucracy, he attacks the Congress, he attacks Washington, he goes out on the road and after having quadrupled the deficit, and he says, those big spenders back there are something awful. I mean, he says, where else but in Washington would they take the department that's in charge of the whole outdoors and call it the Department of the Interior? He was introducing Bob Hope at a dinner, and he said, you know, Bob Hope has two great loves, entertaining the troops and golf. And before the dinner, he said, Mr. President, what's your handicap? And I said, Congress. He's constantly attacking the government. He's constantly attacking the Congress. Another subject that has occupied his humor is communism. And he uses humor to show the difference between our two political systems. This is a story he told Mr. Gorbachev when they met in Geneva. That's why they got along so well, I suppose. He told of an American and a Russian who were talking about the merits of their two systems, their two governmental systems. And the American said, well, you know, in my country, I can walk into the Oval Office, I can slam my fist on the desk, I say, Mr. President, I don't like the way you're running the United States. And the Soviet says, well, so I can do the same thing in the Soviet Union. I can walk into Politburo at Kremlin, I can slam my fist on the desk, and I can say, I don't like the way Ronald Reagan's running the United States. Reagan uses humor to praise optimism and to make everyone feel good. He says, look at the bright side. He said, be optimistic. And he tells a story to exemplify that. He tells a story of a man whose friend is so successful that he's opened a branch office. And so he has sent a floral arrangement to the opening. And when he gets there, he is shocked and dismayed to see that the wreath says, rest in peace. And so the man is very disturbed with this, rushes to the florist and complains. And the florist says, be optimistic, relax. Look at the bright side of this situation. Somewhere there's a man buried under a wreath that says, good luck in your new location. But when Reagan attacks the government with humor, as he does most often, he makes the point, he doesn't attack Kennedy, he doesn't attack Roosevelt. He says they were misguided. He said that an awful lot of programs were developed that should not have been developed out of good intentions, and good intentions paved the way to hell. He tells one story that exemplifies this, that exemplifies the view that before you set out to help people, you'd better know what you're doing. He tells a story of a man riding a motorcycle down a highway on a wintry day, and the wind is whipping through the buttonholes on his leather jacket. So he stops, turns the jacket around, buttons it up back, and continues down the highway. Then he hits a patch of ice, skids into a tree, and is knocked unconscious. Later, a policeman arrives, says to an onlooker, what happened? The guy says, well, I don't know. I mean, when I got here, he seemed to be all right, but then we tried to turn his head around. And Reagan is making the point, before you try to turn the head around, you'd better know what you're doing, and you'd better know what's wrong with people. He made another point, which I think was very well taken. He said, I have no illusion about advisors. He says, I know that someday my advisors will go on to advise other people, and I will be left with the responsibility for my decisions. And so I'm always a little skeptical about advice. And to exemplify this very laudable philosophy, he tells a story of a man who has fallen off a cliff. And as he is falling, he grabs a twig that's projecting from the side of the cliff, and he's holding on for dear life. He looks down to the canyon floor, which is 600 feet below, and he's terrified. He looks toward heaven, and he says, Lord, if there's anyone up there, give me faith and tell me what to do. And a voice comes booming down from the heavens saying, if ye have faith, let go. Well, the man looks down to the canyon floor 600 feet below, looks up again and says, is there anyone else up there? Now, Gerald Ford could enjoy humor. He could enjoy it, but he couldn't replicate it. He couldn't produce it. He couldn't create it in the sense that Reagan can, in the sense that Kennedy could, in a spontaneous way. He was sort of tone-deaf to comedy. And Jerry Ford was the object of a lot of very malicious humor from Lyndon Johnson. You may remember Johnson remarked on one occasion, Jerry Ford played football too long without a helmet. Nasty little joke. He said on another occasion, I doubt that Gerald Ford can walk and chew gum at the same time, which was a cleaned-up version of what he actually said. Gerald Ford was a very decent man, but when the Washington Post interviewed some of his friends and assembled a list of adjectives describing him, they called him slow, plodding, unimaginative, non-intellectual, poorly staffed, out-of-touch, pedestrian, and inarticulate. And those were his friends. Now, as long as Ford was in Congress, he was all right. Then suddenly after Watergate, you'll remember, Ford became the president, and his aides realized it was necessary to mold a new perception for Jerry Ford. And so they mounted this massive image-building campaign, and the cornerstone of this was humor. Now, Bob Hartman was Ford's chief confidant, and he knew his boss's deficiencies. He fed him a wonderful line, which was quite prophetic. Ford said, remember, I'm a Ford, not a Lincoln. And he was. Hartman saw the need to give Jerry Ford sort of a facade of humor. And so very early in the life of the Jerry Ford presidency, he put in a call to Bob Orban. Now, Bob is one of the premier gag writers out here in Hollywood. Orban had first come to Ford's attention when Jerry Ford was still in the Congress, and he was invited to address the Gridiron Club. Now, the Gridiron Club, as you may know, is the club to which the cream of Washington journalism belongs, and they hold these annual dinners, and they usually invite a Republican and a Democrat to speak. And Ford felt very ill-equipped for this kind of display of comedy. He wasn't a stand-up comedian by any means. And so Jerry Ford did what any of us would do under those conditions. He turned to Barry Goldwater. Now, Goldwater referred him to Senator George Murphy, if you remember, the former song and dance man. Murphy had gone to Russia with Shirley Temple, and they had danced down the steps. Skelton referred him to his chief gag writer, who was Bob Orban. And Orban constructed a speech for Ford that just delighted the correspondents at the Gridiron Club. I remember one of the things that Ford said. He said, speaking of Dick Nixon, he said, Dick Nixon doesn't have to stay in politics for the money. Only last week, the Schick Razor Company offered him $2 million to do a shaving commercial for Gillette. He said, Dick is the only candidate who gets 5 o'clock shadow on the Today Show. So it was a funny routine, and the reporters were quite surprised. They viewed Ford as kind of a soporific congressman from Grand Rapids, and here he was sort of a cross between Mort Saul and Mark Russell. And so he got a very warm response. Now, when Jerry Ford suddenly found himself president of the United States, he put in a crisis call to Bob Orban. Bob came to the West Wing of the White House, where his job was to insert jokes into Jerry Ford's speeches, and he was quite good at it. In his first speech as president, Jerry Ford said, so much has happened to me lately. First, I became America's first instant vice president. Then I became America's first instant president. The Marine Corps band is so confused, they don't know whether to play Hail to the Chief or You've Come a Long Way, Baby. Ford employed the humor of modesty, and he had a good deal to be modest about. He would kid himself. He would kid his shortcomings. One of the things he kidded was his deficiencies as an orator. He was not the greatest speaker in the world. So Bob Orban put a 3x5 card on the inside cover of Ford's speech binder, and he said, Mr. President, whenever you flub a line, here's what you say. And the line said, I told my wife I knew this speech backwards, and that's the way I'm giving it. Now, Ford came to like that line so much that he would purposely flub lines in order to use it. But Ford could make fun of his own poor ability as an orator. He said, I was giving a speech once in Omaha, and after the speech I was taken to a reception in another part of town, and at the reception a sweet little old lady came up to me. She put her gloved hand in mine and she said, I heard you gave a speech here tonight. And I said, oh, it was nothing. And she said, yes, that's what I heard. He would kid his clumsiness mainly and his awkwardness. Now, he had fallen down the ramp when emerging from an airliner. You may remember, and all the cameramen who were there on the spot to record it for history. This was in Munich. On another occasion, he banged his head on the top of a helicopter door. And he felt the best way to deal with this reputation for clumsiness was to try to laugh it away. He said, you know, I don't agree with those who called me the Evel Knievel of politics. He said, when I was courting my wife, we would go dancing to the music of the big bands. But we had a problem. Betty had studied modern dance, and I was a football player. And Betty was very polite. She never really came right out and said I was a lousy dancer, but she did have a theory as to why I was a center and not a quarterback. She said, that's the one position you don't have to move your feet. Ford would kid his golf game, too. He once said, what really hurt me is when Arnold Palmer asked me not to wear his slacks except under an assumed name. So you can always tell a good golfer by the number of people in the gallery. Said, you've heard of Arnie's Army. My group is Ford's Few. Said, the Secret Service men around here, when I play golf, they qualify for combat pay. There was one evening when Ford spoke at a correspondence dinner to defuse the clumsiness issue. Chevy Chase, you'll remember, was mocking Ford's clumsiness on Saturday Night Live very regularly. Kept falling down stairs and walking into doors. It was embarrassing for Ford. And so they invited Chevy Chase as guest of honor at the Washington Correspondents' Dinner at the White House. And what Ford did to defuse this whole clumsiness business, they put a big pile of railroad silver and pottery on the table. And when Ford got up to speak, he caught the tablecloth in his trousers, and he dumped the whole pile of silverware on Chevy Chase's lap. He said, I'm sorry. Then he walked to the podium holding the speech in his hand, and he tripped. And 15 pages went flying out over the audience. And Dan Rather and Walter Cronkite were racing around to retrieve the pages. And when Ford reached the microphone, he said very solemnly, he said, "Good evening, I'm Gerald Ford, and you're not." So Ford did not like dirty jokes. He would, you could tell him a dirty joke and it was at your own peril. He could turn very chilly, pretend not to understand it, and maybe he didn't. But sometimes Orban would slip a risque line into a speech. Ford once said, people say a lot of nice things about vice presidents, but it's like being the best man at a wedding. You never get a chance to prove it. For a man who was really quite decent in every way, Ford's humor could sometimes be a little malicious. He once said to Ronald Reagan, he said, there's a lot of speculation about whether Mr. Reagan dyes his hair. Now, that's silly. He does not dye his hair. He's just prematurely orange. On another occasion, he was at a banquet, and there was a wall of roses. And he said, "Look at that wall of roses. Wouldn't that be a great corsage for Bella Abzug?" He said, "No." He said, I'm only kidding." He said, "We both use the same slogan. I am my own man." So Ford could occasionally turn a little bitter. He once said of Bobby Kennedy, he said, "Bobby's at that awkward age. He's too young to be president and too old for that haircut." Now, Jimmy Carter was rather an arrogant man, or many of the people who worked for him felt he was. And he had a rather sarcastic sense of humor, which many arrogant people do. His chief speechwriter, Jim Fallows, who now works for the Atlantic Monthly, once sent in a draft of a speech, and it came back marked C-. That was an example. They used to say about Jimmy Carter, Jimmy's idea of self-deprecating his humor is to insult his staff. Jimmy used to needle his kid brother, Billy, and Billy did not appreciate this form of recognition. Jimmy Carter once said, "I was trying to involve Billy more in the government. I was going to reorganize and put the CIA and the FBI together, but Billy said he would not head any agency he couldn't spell." Some people in public life seem very humorless on the surface. Actually, underneath, they have a good sense of humor. Bobby Kennedy was a good example of that. He gave the impression of being a very cold, prosecutorial type, but his sense of humor, I found, was every bit as good as his older brother's. I recall one occasion in the living room of a suite at the Carlisle, where Bobby was meeting with Fred Papert, who was the head of his ad agency, and Fred was describing the TV campaign he was going to run of commercials in the forthcoming election campaign against Senator Keating. And he said, "Bobby, we have a great campaign of TV commercials planned. We have 10-second spots. We have 60-second spots. We have 2-minute spots. Every one of them, Bobby, is designed to present you as a warm, sincere individual." And Bobby looked up and said, "You're going to use double?" So humor can be very well hidden sometimes. It's a great device for handling hecklers, of course. Mondale found that he was surrounded by hecklers. It was an occupational hazard for politicians. Al Smith was addressing a group when a man in the back started shouting, "Tell them all you know, Al." And Smith thought a minute and he shouted back, "I'll tell them all we both know that won't take any longer." The master of the game, though, I really think the master of the game as far as humor is concerned has to be Jack Kennedy. James Reston once said, Kennedy can seduce you with a smile and a wisecrack, and he really could. He had a marvelous taste for humor. He once said, there are only 3 things in life that are real: God, human folly, and laughter. And the first 2 are beyond our comprehension, so we'll have to make do with the third. And he really did make do with the third. He had a way of laughing at the press. It was very engaging, even to the people he was laughing with or at. During his campaign against Richard Nixon, Kennedy was surprised to discover that the New York Times, which was normally Republican, was endorsing him. And he said, I am someone who can truly say I got my job through the New York Times. Some of his most interesting mail came from newspapermen who really adored him. He once got a letter from columnist Leonard Lyons of the New York Post, which reported that the prices for signed photos of presidents at that time included George Washington, $100, Franklin Roosevelt, $75, Ulysses Grant, $50, and John Kennedy, $200. So Kennedy wrote a note to Leonard Lyons. He said, "Dear Leonard, I appreciate your letter about the market on Kennedy signatures. It's hard to believe the going price is so high now. In order not to depress the market, I will not sign this letter." and he didn't. Some columnists were very critical of Kennedy, and Kennedy turned the force of his own wit on them. One of these was Arthur Krock, the distinguished Washington columnist. But Doris Fleeson liked Kennedy very much, and Kennedy once said, "All I know is I'd rather be Fleesonized than crocked." Arthur Krock once criticized Kennedy for not inviting Moise Tshombe, the black president of Katanga, to the United States. Well, Kennedy learned that Arthur Krock belonged to a segregated Washington club. So he said to Krock, "Arthur, I'll make a deal with you. I'll invite Tshombe to the United States if you invite him to the Metropolitan Club." He loved to needle Arthur Krock, and once when addressing a correspondence dinner, Kennedy said, "I'm glad to see my old friend Arthur Krock here. Mr. Krock has been at every major dinner in history, except the Last Supper." And he had a relative at that one. Kennedy was at his funniest, I think, before the Gridiron Club. You see, each year, as I mentioned, the cream of Washington journalism celebrate their own self-importance at the Gridiron Club. And it's an evening of off-the-record sketches and songs, and the influential correspondents, of course, dominate the proceedings. And one of these dinners was kind of a launching pad for Kennedy's use of humor, and it showed him just how valuable humor could be to his ambitions. He was still a senator when they invited him, and he worried more about that speech than anything in his office, anything in the nation, or in the campaign or the world. He regretted having accepted the invitation. He was hearing stories about gridiron speakers who'd fallen on their face, and he was sure that nobody would really care except to write him off as a funny fellow if he was good, and if he were bad, it would have a very adverse effect on his presidential ambitions. So he was busy collecting funny lines all over town for quite a while. He was a major presidential candidate at the time, and the reporters did a version of Cole Porter's "My Heart Belongs to Daddy," in which the song became "Just Send the Bill to Daddy because Daddy pays it so well." And when the sketches were over, Jack Kennedy came to the microphone and he said, "I brought my brother Teddy with me this evening. There was no one else to leave him with." He said that he wasn't alone in seeking the Democratic presidential nomination, of course. Two other men who were seeking it were Lyndon Johnson and Hubert Humphrey. And Jack Kennedy said, "I had a dream the other night. I told Hubert and Lyndon about it in the cloakroom today. I told them how the Lord came into my bedroom and anointed my head and said, 'John Kennedy, I hereby appoint you President of the United States.'" And Hubert came up to me and said, "That's strange, Jack, because I had a similar dream last night in which the Lord appointed me President of the United States." And then Lyndon Johnson came up to me and said, "That's very interesting, gentlemen, because I had a similar dream last night, and I don't remember anointing either one of you." You see, the Democratic Party had a lot of candidates for the presidency that year, 1960. Many of them were in the U.S. Senate, and Kennedy said, "I hear there was a poll in which they had asked each senator about his preference for the presidency, and 96 senators each got one vote." President Eisenhower was in the White House at the time, and the country was in a recession, and Ike was trying to conceal the recession from the public, and Kennedy said, "As I interpret President Eisenhower, we are now at the end of the beginning of the upturn of the downturn. And every bright spot that the White House finds in the economy is like the policeman who's bending over the body in the alley, and he says cheerfully, 'Well, two of the wounds are fatal, but one of them's not so bad.'" He returned to the Gridiron Club once he was president, and he told the reporters the inside story of his new government. He told them what goes on at his cabinet meetings. He said, "Here, gentlemen, are the official minutes of what took place at the last cabinet meeting." He said, "My brother Bobby, the Attorney General, was late again. That's happened ever since Jimmy Hoffa organized the taxicab drivers." Says the Secretary of Defense, Mr. McNamara, had us all playing a new game on the panel on my desk, button, who'll push which button. One brings in my secretary, one calls the chef, and the other blows up Siberia. The Secretary of the Treasury, Mr. Dillon, reported the worst of the recession was not yet spent, but everything else was. Regarding the religious issue, I asked the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court whether he thought our education bill was constitutional, and he said it was clearly constitutional. It hadn't got a prayer. Now, Jack Kennedy did not like anecdotes. in the same sense that Reagan does, in the sense that Lyndon Johnson does. I mean, Jack Kennedy's humor was very brief, very bright, very laconic. He did tell one joke. Arthur Goldberg, you may remember, was his Secretary of Labor. And Jack Kennedy said, I went up to New York stressing physical fitness, and in line with that, my Secretary of Labor, Arthur Goldberg, went over with a group to Switzerland to climb one of the mountains there. And when they all came back at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, he didn't come back with them, so they sent out a search party, and there was no sign that afternoon and night. And the next day, the Red Cross went out calling, Goldberg, Goldberg, it's the Red Cross. Then this voice came down from the mountain, I gave at the office. One of the few jokes that Jack Kennedy ever told in his political career. But he didn't care much for these long, rambling stories. His humor was not folksy. On the campaign trail, he used to get tired of hearing his own jokes over and over again. He didn't like tasteless jokes, such as the ones Johnson was partial to. Kennedy's humor could sometimes, though, have a bawdy streak. He sometimes could tell rather raunchy stories. He would swim with Dave Powers in the White House pool every afternoon, and some of the stories they exchanged would raise an eyebrow. There was one occasion when Kennedy told a joke that had a rather bawdy touch. Kennedy was meeting with Dean Rusk and McGeorge Bundy and Ted Sorensen about the Berlin crisis on one occasion. And suddenly, speaking of Khrushchev, Kennedy said, and he's a good dancer, too. And Dean Rusk said, what was that, Mr. President? And he said, oh, no, nothing. That's just from a joke I was telling Ted. And Dean Rusk shoved the position papers about the Berlin crisis aside. And he said, Mr. President, would you mind telling us that joke? And here is the joke that Kennedy related to his 3 aides. He said, well, it seems there was this fellow, he meets a girl at a bar, and he tells her his name is Peterson, and that he's a big shot at the Department of Agriculture. And then he takes her back to his apartment for the usual purpose. And they continue to meet every few days over the next month or so, till one day she phones the Department of Agriculture, and she asks for Mr. Peterson. And they say, we don't have any Mr. Peterson here. She said, no, you must have. He's a big shot at the Department of Agriculture. Now, let me speak to Mr. Peterson. They said, we don't have any Mr. Peterson. And they transfer the call into the personnel office. And the personnel clerk says, I'm sorry, we have no Mr. Peterson at the Department of Agriculture. And the girl says, you must. He's a big shot there. And she checks again, and she says, wait a minute. Wait a minute. We do have a Mr. Peterson. But believe me, he's not a big shot. He's just a pheasant plucker. And the girl says, yes, and he's a good dancer, too. That story gave me a fresh insight into the humor of John Kennedy. But generally, Kennedy's humor was very brief. He didn't like trite humor. He didn't use slang or dialect. He seldom used humor in the body of a speech. He felt the place for humor was at the beginning. He didn't like jokes. He preferred historical anecdotes. He often worked as hard on the funny opening of a speech as he did on the serious substance of it, and he developed a habit of scribbling down funny lines from Toastmasters, from politicians. He'd jot down witty observations by Will Rogers and others. And he had one little trick. He would always omit the humor from the printed texts that would go out to the reporters, and that way he could use them again and again because they never showed up in his stories. Kennedy was at his best, I think, humorously, when he was on a campaign trail. He realized the most important thing you had to do in a campaign speech was let the audience know who they were, you knew where they were, and you knew what their problems were, and humor could do that for you. In Texas, he told about a man from Boston who was visiting the Alamo, and a Texan was boasting about the courage of the men who fought at the Alamo, Bowie and Crockett and Houston and the rest. And finally, the Bostonian has had it up to here, and he says, all right, he says, wait a minute. He says, haven't you ever heard of Paul Revere? And the Texan said, oh, yes, he's the guy who ran for help. In Iowa, Kennedy told a joke. He said, how can a farmer vote Republican? I understand here in Iowa there was a farmer who planted some corn, and he said to his neighbor, I hope I break even this year. I really need the money. He loved to needle Nixon with humor. He would say, people don't understand the great responsibility I carry. I'm the only man standing between Richard Nixon and the White House. Nixon would often take a very pious, self-righteous tone, and he would stress his own moral superiority, and Kennedy would kid him about that. Nixon, you may remember, came out against the use of profanity by presidents, which was a little amusing when the Watergate tapes came out with all those expletives deleted. And Kennedy said, one of the intriguing notes that was struck in the last TV debate was struck by Mr. Nixon in his very moving warning to the children of the nation against the use of profanity. But I'm told that a prominent Republican said to him in Jacksonville, Mr. Vice President, that was a damn fine speech. And Nixon said, well, I appreciate the compliment, but I don't appreciate the language. And the Republican said, yes, sir, I liked it so much I gave $10,000 to your campaign. And Nixon said, the hell you say? Kennedy had a great way of needling his friends. Clark Clifford is a Washington attorney who had assembled recommendations for the Kennedy cabinet during the transition period. And Jack Kennedy said, I owe a great debt of thanks to Clark Clifford. He chose my whole cabinet. He chose my entire sub-cabinet, and all he ever asked in return was that we advertise his law firm on the back of the $1 bills. He said, George Smathers, my old friend, my dearest friend, my faithful advisor. He and I came to the Congress together. We've been associated for many years, and I regard him as one of my most valuable counselors. Now, in 1952, when I was thinking of running for the United States Senate, I went to Senator Smathers, and I said, George, what do you think? And he said, don't do it. You can't win. It's a bad year. Well, I ran, and I won. In 1956, I was at Democratic Convention, and I didn't know whether I should run for vice president or not. So I said, George, what do you think? And he said, this is it. They need a young man. It's your chance. So I ran, and I lost. In 1960, I was wondering whether I ought to run in the West Virginia primary, and George said, don't do it. That state you can't possibly carry. And I ran, and I won. And actually, the only time I really got nervous was election night during the balloting when George came up to me and said, I think it looks pretty good for you. But the basic importance of humor to a president, I think, is exemplified by this story. A couple of years ago, a man named Marvin Pancoast went on trial for the murder of Vicki Morgan. Now, Vicki Morgan, as you all remember, was the mistress of Alfred Bloomingdale, who was a close friend of the Reagans. Now, at the time, a Beverly Hills lawyer named Robert Steinberg said, I have a videotape showing Vicki Morgan sexually cavorting with 3 highly placed members of the Reagan team. And then, the day after, Larry Flint, the editor of Hustler magazine, announced, I, too, have a videotape showing Vicki Morgan sexually cavorting with 3 highly placed members of the Ronald Reagan team. And Mort Saul said at the time, this cynical attempt to humanize the Reagan administration
all the presidential wits you've dealt with is basically since 1960 on. Were there any wonderful examples going back in history?
Well, prior to Kennedy, the examples of presidential comedy writers in the West Wing of the White House are very rare. Robert Sherwood, the very talented playwright, used to write humor for Franklin Roosevelt. But when you think back to the humor of Calvin Coolidge, where is it? So prior to the age of television, television came in the early 50s, and with it, as the audience grew, the importance of the charisma of a president grew, and therefore that was the moment in time when they turned to Hollywood generally, and they said, we have to bring in people who will make us warm and witty and wonderful.
Do you have any examples of George Bush's humor?
George Bush's humor. Well, George Bush, when he was debating with Geraldine Ferraro, you remember, the day after, George Bush, unaware of a lurking microphone, said, we really kicked some ass last night. Actually, George Bush has been quite amusing. George Bush delivered a speech in which John Riggins of the Washington Redskins fell asleep at the table of one of the Chief Justices, Sandra Day O'Connor. But George Bush's speech was, and I saw it on C-SPAN, was extremely funny. So Bush, whatever his political assets, does have a fine sense of humor. Yes, sir.
Wasn't there a classic exchange between Dan Rather and Richard Nixon?
Yes, there was indeed. The exchange went something like this. Dan Rather at the time was the White House correspondent for CBS News, and it was amidst of the Watergate inquiry, and it was known that Rather was antagonistic to Mr. Nixon. And so when Nixon recognized Dan Rather, pointed to him in the audience at this press conference, Rather stood up and he said, Dan Rather, CBS News. And the audience, half the audience burst into applause because they knew he didn't like Nixon, and the other half booed him. And Nixon said, "Are you running for something?" And rather, without a moment's hesitation, said, "No, sir, are you?" And a lot of people felt that was a bit out of line, but that was an example of the rather humor, which is being kept in check.
Most of the humor you talked about this evening was very charming. But does
Boy,
your
that's
book-
really damning with faint praise, Andy.
No, I'm serious. Does your book deal at all with the comments that end up being very offensive, where the politician has to pay for a very long time? And I don't mean offensive.
Oh, yes. As a matter of fact, there's one chapter in All the President's Wits about the dangers of political humor, and there have been a number of major political figures who have suffered from, their career ended because of a political joke. The most recent that come to mind, James Watt, if you remember, told a joke in which he said, "I just appointed an affirmative action committee, and it's really affirmative action. We have a black, a Jew, a cripple, and a woman." And 3 days later, he was gone. And that was an attempt at humor. Earl Butz, who was Gerald Ford's Secretary of Agriculture, told to John Dean, of all people, if you want to tell a joke to end your career, he's the one to tell it to. He told John Dean a joke, which I won't dignify this cassette by repeating, about the sexual proclivities of some ethnic group. And that got him out of the Ford cabinet almost overnight. George Bush's joke about we kick some ass has done him no good. Ronald Reagan, because he's kind of the Teflon president, his offensive jokes hadn't seemed to hurt him. He, if you remember, didn't realize the mic was open. He did a mic test in which he said, "I have just signed legislation eliminating the Soviet Union, and the bombs start dropping in 5 minutes." Well, several of his supporters said, "I hope this isn't another empty campaign promise." And but that joke didn't seem to hurt him. Reagan, at a gridiron dinner subsequent to that, told the joke in which he said, "Maybe we ought to keep the grain and export the farmers." And all the correspondents gasped, but it hasn't seemed to have troubled his. They say that the Teflon presidency, nothing seems to hurt Mr. Reagan, and a good example of the Teflon presidency is there were some demonstrators outside the White House burning Mr. Reagan in effigy, and the effigy kept blowing out the flames. So nothing seems to damage him too seriously. Oh, he used to tell anti-gay jokes when he was governor of California. He would tell anti-ethnic jokes. One of them, I'm trying to think what it. Oh yes, he said gays could find a very felicitous home inside the Department of Recreation and Parks. That was one of his jokes. He said, who is the one who brings a duck to a cockfight? And he said, "That's the Pole." He says, "And who bets on the duck?" He says, "That's the Italian." "And how do you know if the mafia is there, the duck wins?" That was the joke. And he goes on. So none of his but most of his humor, as you can see, is really very benign. Reagan's humor is really generally, much of it is just sort of gutted out of old Reader's Digest. But a lot of his humor, and some of it where he picks up lines from Rambo and Clint Eastwood, he obviously has a very genuine, humble sense of humor.
Based on their ability at humor, who would you think would be the next candidates for president?
Well, if all the public cared about was how funny the candidate was, which is all they do care about. No, that's an overstatement. If all the electorate cared about was the humorous gifts, I would say it would be toss-up on the two parties between Bob Dole for the Republicans and Mario Cuomo for the Democrats, because they're both very witty men. Bob Dole's humor could be very abrasive, and he's learning to tone down some of the bile. Mario Cuomo was quoted as saying something I found very amusing. He was speaking to an elderly Jewish lady, and as he was talking, Governor Cuomo's press secretary sneezed, And the old Jewish lady said, Governor Cuomo, you know, in my religion, when someone sneezes, it means you've just told the truth. And Cuomo turned to his press secretary and he says, from now on, you only sneeze on my lines. So on the basis of that, I see Cuomo as having an early lead. Yes, Amy.
I was just thinking, what about some of the major running mates? Did Eugene McCarthy have a sense of humor? Or,
Eugene McCarthy did, but Eugene McCarthy, like Stevenson, there was kind of a whiff of arrogance and intellectual quality to Eugene McCarthy. McCarthy has since written a few books which are rather satirical and dry and funny, and you get a sense of McCarthy's humor. Eugene McCarthy said, Adlai Stevenson loves books, and he keeps threatening to read one. But yes, McCarthy did have an excellent sense of humor. But Mondale, I must say, Mondale did not. Maybe Mondale had a good private sense of humor, and that was a problem in running against Reagan, of course. But they say the three thinnest books in the world are the books of modest anchormen, humble politicians, and Norwegians with a sense of humor. And Mondale really didn't have that much of a sense of humor, and it hurt him with running against, you know, the great entertainer, the great communicator, Ronald Reagan.
As a result of writing this book and doing this cassette, does this mean that your career as a presidential speechwriter is limited?
I don't know. It depends upon the sale of the book and the cassette, I would say. We'll have to keep it out of Washington's. It's interesting that the people who have been closest to the president and who have written humor about them, written humor for them, I should say, have been really quite forthcoming and open about the contributions they've made. Bob Orban and Don Penny and Landon Parvin and Jerry Doolittle, who have written humor for the past few presidents, really speak quite, because I don't think there's anything reprehensible in a president hiring someone to write humor for him, any more than it's reprehensible to hire someone to write speeches. It would be a misuse of public funds to have our presidents sitting in the Oval Office writing jokes. Really, that would be a terrible waste of taxpayers' money. And the key to presidential humor is that it's an attempt to humanize the President of the United States, and it works very well. So I think it behooves us all, when we're laughing at the disarming wit of a presidential candidate in the forthcoming campaigns, to ask ourselves, just how important is charm and wit in a United States president? Otherwise, one of these candidates will laugh all the way to the White House. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Copyright 1986, Dove Books on Tape, Incorporated.